I wanted to thank you all who are here for coming to this first webinar. The webinar is called The Conservative View on Abolishing the Death Penalty. Today we have with us Hannah Cox, who's the Senior National Manager of Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. Hannah is a conservative writer and political activist. Her work revolves around the defense of free markets, individual liberty, and limited government. Many of you have read Hannah's work. A number of you have probably seen her. Hannah is the Newsmax insider, and she writes a column called Life and Liberty. She's a regular conservative libertarian commentator. And I've seen Hannah on behalf of conservatives concerned about the death penalty. I've seen her on a number of programs on death penalty action, Voices of Experience for the Death Penalty, the Virginians Against the Death Penalty Expert Opinion Series. Recently, Hannah was on the March 2020 episode with Death Penalty Information Center called Discussions with DPF. She was on that event with Robert Dunham. She spoke about the continuing movement in social and political conservatives away from capital punishment and talked about how the death penalty is out of step with core conservative values. I would like to introduce you all to Hannah Cox and welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Nancy.
Oh, you are welcome. Okay, let me introduce you also to, just give me one sec here. Let me introduce you here to Jared Cox. Jared Cox is a...
I had to change my name because it came in as, for some reason, instead of Hannah Cox.
I'm losing my mind here. Okay,
I'm definitely not the ever beautiful and intelligent Hannah Cox, but I am Representative Jared Olsen.
Okay, Jared Olsen, thank you. Okay, I'm so sorry. This is Representative Jared Olsen. He's a two-term Republican member of the Wyoming House of Representatives. Jared represents House District 11, which is downtown Cheyenne, which is a town that I actually love quite a bit. The capital and the largest city of Wyoming is Cheyenne. Jared is the chairman of the Select Committee on Blockchain, Financial Technology, and Digital Innovations, and that would be a marvelous conversation to have at another time. He's a member of the Joint Appropriations Committee. Most importantly to us, in 2019, Jared sponsored a bill to repeal the death penalty in Wyoming. Coming closer than any effort in Wyoming's history, the repeal bill soundly passed the Republican-controlled House and fell short in the Senate by 4 votes, unfortunately. Anyhow, in 2020, Jared reintroduced the repeal bill with 39 co-sponsors from all ends of the political spectrum: Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, and leadership. Jared is a small business owner, a lawyer, and most importantly, a husband and father. And we welcome you, Jared Olsen.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And it's a first for me to be joining you and your organization attendees, but I'm happy to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Shall I just let you go? I've seen both of you speak several times, and I'm happy to let you take it away for now.
Sure. Well, thank you so much again for having us. I think we're excited to have this conversation. Jared and I get to talk about the issue a lot, but one of the cool things is that this is still a really new subject for a lot of audiences. When I first took over as the national manager for Conservatives Concerned, I had a lot of people that predicted I would get really lambasted by my followers and I'd have a lot of people mad with me. And that's never been my experience. I've actually always found that people were either very excited to learn about the existence of Conservatives Concerned and were already questioning these issues and wanted a bit more information or were excited to connect, or they were just genuinely confused. They were people who have been brought up to support the death penalty as Republicans and weren't aware that so many Republicans were turning against it. And so, Jared, I know that for you in Wyoming, you've had an amazing experience as a sponsor of this issue. And as a Republican have found significant success championing this. So I'd love for you to tell people how you became opposed to death penalty and what made you decide to take it on and really champion it in Wyoming.
Sure. And I like to,
Yes, I'll need both of you to speak a little more clearly and into your mics because people are having a hard time hearing you.
Okay.
Let me pause for second to make sure. Let me just check the microphone that I have on mine. So I can talk loud. So hopefully that helps. And I appreciated what Hannah, you said about what people thought your followers might think, being a libertarian, being a conservative in those circles, and then all of a sudden, hey, I don't support the death penalty. Because I went through the same process. You can imagine in Wyoming, for those of you out there who may not be familiar with Wyoming, it is a deeply, deeply red state. So right now, Donald Trump is polling with about 79%, maybe 81%, depending on which county you hit. So that gives you an idea of how red it is. In the legislature where I serve, there are 90 of us. And out of 90, there are 12 Democrats. So a super, super minority in the state of Wyoming. So for a Republican to come out in front of this issue, it might seem surprising. And I wondered the same thing, whether in Wyoming how my followers would react. But I became deeply involved in the death penalty because I am a conservative. I am very much pro-life. I believe in the sanctity of human life. I think that as a conservative, I think that if you're going to support life because it is sacred, because it is God-given and it is a natural right that we have, then we have to support it not just at conception or in the womb, but after birth. And after birth, even when choices are good or bad by an individual, regardless of whatever that choice is, it's still a sacred life. And so I think you have to be consistent in your values and support life from conception until natural death. The interesting thing is, in the state of Wyoming, our Republican Party platform, the first plank of our platform actually says that we support life from conception to natural death. Even though there is still somewhat of a division in Wyoming on what natural death means, for me, that means being consistent. So yeah, the main way that I became involved is it just squares so perfectly with my personal values, my religious beliefs, my morals, and I think it just fits squarely with conservatism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I hope this is better microphone wise. I had to switch over the Zoom settings because it was trying to still use my built-in mic, I think. So let me know if that's not better, Nancy, on your end.
Thank you. That's good, Hannah.
Okay, thank you. Jared, I think that's such an amazing point to make. I've often told people, especially Republican lawmakers when we're discussing this issue, that no one can get mad at you for being consistently pro-life, right? That is a very just moral stance to take. And I think that we've seen a lot of problems with the pro-life movement over the decades where they've gotten a lot of notoriety, they have really big platforms, but they're not always super consistent in their values. And I think that that hurts the other issues that they do choose to champion, where people don't see them as having consistent ethos. The death penalty is something that I initially supported. I was somebody who had never been around the system. I was someone who thought that if I were a victim's family member, I would want this. I thought it deterred crime. I thought it saved money. You know, all the normal things that we now know are nowhere close to the truth of how this actually operates. But that was what I believed to be true. I don't know that someone coming to me and saying this wasn't a pro-life argument would have landed, but I do know if someone had come to me and talked to me about the innocence issues in the system, then it would have landed. Because I think for some people like you and I, you know, now I'm where you are, I think it's not consistently pro-life to ever be in favor of the death penalty. But there are others in our movement that would say, you know, theoretically, they have no problem with the death penalty, but in practice, they find it inexcusable. And a lot of people would point to the innocence numbers in the system. We've had one person exonerated for every 9 executions. We've had hundreds of other people who've been wrongfully convicted and who had their sentences overturned, but maybe weren't fully exonerated. And then we've had many others who we've executed who I feel strongly were innocent. And I think that we continue to do that every year in the cases that I've seen. And so for anyone who says that they are a pro-life advocate or that they believe in a limited government, that is simply unacceptable.
Yeah, the limited government, huge. I think that's the other consistency that Republicans and conservatives need to really circle the wagons around and be consistent on. If we believe in a limited government, one that has less interference with an individual's life and liberty on a daily basis, then there is no greater limitation in our government than repealing the death penalty. empowering the state to take a life, whether that is an innocent life or a guilty life, it's very antithetical to limited government. So I think that's right, to be consistent in that principle, and especially if you, not just to say, hey, I support limited government, therefore I don't support the death penalty, but like you're pointing out, I think when someone really sits down and dives into the system and really understands how it is applied, whether we're talking about the almost near impossible task of actually finding true guilt in our system, as you speak to with consistent exonerations across the nation, or whether we're simply talking about how it's applied racially, how it is equally applied based on racial status and socioeconomic status, but also like in Wyoming, where the racial status is less of an issue, but more of an issue on how it's applied on the socioeconomic scale. We have 23 counties, and Wyoming is a mineral-rich state. So our wealth comes from minerals, and minerals they're a very big state, so they're not in every county. So the more wealthy counties we're finding, we believe, and the data is starting to show us, the more wealthy counties are the ones that pursue capital punishment cases. And so there's a wholly inadequacy in the system when you have poorer counties that don't seek it, but richer counties do. So wherever you live or wherever you're born is dependent on whether you are put into a system where where your life is in jeopardy. And so that doesn't make any sense either.
Yeah, and I want to dig into the cost around it a little bit, because I think everybody knows it's expensive. Many people are misinformed on why it's expensive, which really goes back to the trial, where we see 70% of the cost and more originating. And that means even when a jury says no, the taxpayers are still incurring that burden, which can run on average, $700,000 to $1 million in excess per state, and even more than that. And so we do see that it's predominantly the location where the crime was committed that's the driver of who gets that. Nationally, it's 2% of counties that bring the majority of death penalty cases. They do tend to be wealthier counties that can afford to take on those type of cases. But I think that when we're talking about the cost of the system, I often say, I wish Republicans really meant it when they said they were fiscally conservative. The reality is the vast majority of them don't. And you only need to look at the past, this year in politics to see that, I think, and look at how they're voting. And so if you really want conservatives and Republicans to care about the cost issue, I think we have to break down what you're not getting for the money that you're spending. Everybody's okay with big government as long as it's big government programs that they like or that they think works. The reality is that the death penalty doesn't work. It's not a deterrent to crime. But more importantly, when you're spending that much money on a program that doesn't work, it represents a huge opportunity cost. And the reasons that conservatives are pro-limited government and pro-fiscally conservative is that we believe that programs need to take the least amount of money from taxpayers and make sure that they're being efficient in those programs and producing the outcomes that we want. The death penalty is certainly not producing safer communities. It's certainly not something that is helping us intercede and prevent violence in the first place. And so that's a really big opportunity cost that I would argue makes our society less safe. That's money we're not spending on programs that could better work to cure violence and deter crime. And it's money that we're not spending on solving more crimes, which we still do very, very little of. In coming months, I think we're going to see states grappling with that monetary issue in a way that we really haven't seen since the Obama years, when we were in an economic downturn for a very prolonged time period. And it was during that time that states first started kind of grappling with this and saying, do we have the money to carry out this program? Is that prudent? Is that where we should be putting our tax dollars? And your governor recently brought this up in one of your committee hearings. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that's going to impact your work and this issue.
Right. Yeah. Huge in Wyoming, because we are, especially with the pandemic across the country, we're seeing more and more states struggling with their budgets as they enter this new recession that is brought on by the pandemic, brought on by government closures primarily. In the state of Wyoming, we're double hit because we were already entering a recession that was a product of minerals. About a year ago, we had a couple dozen oil rigs in the state of Wyoming. Today, we have one operating oil rig. Most of our major coal mining operations. And mind you, the largest coal company in the world was located here in Wyoming. It declared bankruptcy 1 year ago. So as we entered a recession for minerals and now compounding that with the pandemic, our budget is facing huge constraints. And when I started this endeavor to repeal the death penalty in Wyoming 3 years ago, the main issue that resonated with Republicans was fiscal responsibility. Because we were entering a recession, it made sense to eliminate even $1 million a year from our budget. And I'll talk more in depth upon what that number really means. But so now that we have this additional caveat to our recession that's really compounding it, our governor came out a few weeks ago and said that he would support or may support a moratorium. I had a conversation with him about a week ago. His office continues to look into that from the legal perspective, from the political perspective, and from the fiscal perspective. My conversation with him was that I would certainly support a moratorium, but that either way I would bring a bill to finally abolish the death penalty in Wyoming. He seemed a little surprised by that comment, but I further explained to him that it's not just about a temporary fiscal savings, that for me it is deeply immoral for our government to execute our citizens. So until it's fully off the books in Wyoming, I won't call it good. But more to the fiscal point, I think that's another. You talk about being pro-life, you talk about limited government, and then the next prong, of course, fiscal responsibility. All things that should resonate not just with conservatives, but they should be championing inside of state governments. And so these are the issues that we're champions of. The $1 million is really unique because I think that beyond the false deterrence argument, the number two argument that I often am confronted with by people in Wyoming is, hey, Jared, that's crazy. If you're telling me that a person who sits on death row or sits in prison under a life sentence is going to not cost more to the state of Wyoming than a person who is subject to the death penalty. And it's sometimes hard for people to wrap their minds around, but you said it, about 70% of the cost is up front. It's in the legal process. And that's really it. In Wyoming, well, anywhere in the country, the moment that a prosecutor simply utters the words, hey, I'm thinking this is a capital case, all of these special constitutional protections kick in. And the American Bar Association requires that a defense attorney be death penalty certified, that there be 2 attorneys minimum on the case. And then all these other constitutional safeguards begin to fall into place. And so the cost skyrockets, even if you never go to a trial. And in Wyoming, that's what we see. If we look at the last dozen or so cases, the last person who was executed in Wyoming was in the 90s. So our cost is not through the actual execution. It's through, since the 90s to current, all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of cases that the word capital case was uttered and a defense was put on that cost $1 million, sometimes $2 million per case, just on the defense side, not even calculating the state's expenses because they don't line item the budget. It's just a prosecutor prosecuting a case. And then they reach a settlement. So they're not the cases that you typically think of when you think of a death penalty case, but they're the ones that are incurring the costs all across the country.
During one of your committees last year, which I actually want to circle back to this briefly and just dig into your experience with actually moving this piece of legislation. So you and I didn't know each other last year when you first introduced the bill to repeal the death penalty in Wyoming. I had just taken over my organization a couple months before that, and out of left field, heard there was a bill in Wyoming. I thought, Wyoming? I wouldn't think they would be at a point where they could repeal yet. And you really were just such an exceptional sponsor. You moved it so quickly. You garnered so much support. I think you were an incredible spokesperson and advocate for the issue. And it moved quite quickly. I think within a month it was through the House. And then it was so close to passing in the Senate. I have never seen a bill in my life get that kind of traction and move that quickly, especially when it involves things like the death penalty in a state. You have tremendous support. You now have, I think, almost half, if not over half, of your fellow lawmakers signed on as sponsors. And this year you weren't back with it because Wyoming has budgetary sessions every other year where it is very, very difficult to get legislation introduced that isn't directly related to the budget. And so I think you'll be back next year and see great success. But during the initial session where you were moving the bill, one of the representatives from your public defender's office came and gave testimony in favor of repeal of her own volition. And I wasn't there that day, but I was listening in remotely and was really just floored with how well she articulated the issues that this brought up for her office. We all know that public defenders' offices are not funded very well, that they're often carrying caseloads no human could adequately defend properly. And listening to her discuss the ways that the death penalty increased the cost of their operations was disturbing, but more importantly almost was what that did to their ability to defend other cases. And so as a lawyer, I'm curious to hear what your impression is of the death penalty as a clog on the system and how it kind of impacts other facets of the legal system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as one of my other roles in the legislature is that I sit on the appropriations committee for Wyoming. So we have a biannual budget. We build a budget that is forecasted for 2 years, and then we supplement it every year. So I've been intimately involved now for several years in building the entire budget for the state of Wyoming. And one reoccurring issue that we've had in Wyoming is adequately funding our public defender's office. The Bar Association had recently done basically a study that says, here is the number of cases that we think that each attorney should have. When they go above this limit, then we think they can't adequately represent the clients. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I can tell you we're so far off in Wyoming from adequately representing defendants. It's not even funny. And then when you add in those death penalty cases, as some of the points I made earlier, you have to have a minimum of 2 lawyers staffed on that case at all times, and you can't just have any lawyer. One of those lawyers has to be death penalty certified. In the entire state of Wyoming, I'm only aware of 2, maybe 3 people that are death penalty certified. So it's a very small group of people, especially in a rural state like Wyoming. So it puts huge burdens on the public defender's office, and that's a reoccurring line item that comes up in the state of Wyoming that is grossly underfunded. And so this last budget, not only was our public defender's office seeking money just to try to balance its books, but it was also it also had to fill the death penalty defense fund, because in Wyoming, we have a case that dates back to the 1980s and a murder here in Wyoming. And that individual who has been on death row and off of death row is now back on death row pursuant to a 10th Circuit case and a refusal by the U.S. Supreme Court to hear his appeal. And so because of that, in the last budget, we actually had to appropriate money to that defense fund, which is also a very interesting point, because as a budgeter, I had to budget the money, and I was often asked by people, I thought you didn't support the death penalty. Why are you also funding this death penalty defense fund? And the unfortunate reality is that if you just compound the problem that you're speaking of. If you take all that money away, you still have someone who has constitutional rights, and that's ultimately what we're talking about, right? Is something that is a constitutional right to life and to defense. And so the unfortunate part of the beast is you still have to kind of fuel it, because you can't just leave people undefended, which is a reoccurring problem, I'm sure, across the country.
Yeah, it is. I actually wrote an article about this last year, about how poor of a job we've done at upholding the right to an attorney over the years, and was even shocked as I did my research for that article just how bad it actually was. It was far worse than even I knew. And, you know, I don't know what the stats are nationally, but I know in Texas, 1 in 4 people on their death row was sentenced with an attorney that was a public defender that was later disbarred or disciplined. And, you know, we have amazing attorneys who are public defenders in this country. I think truly incredible, brilliant legal minds. But when you start looking at the number of cases they're carrying, there's just no humanly way possible that you could adequately give somebody a good representation with that. And so when you really start digging into it, it heightens the socioeconomic issues that we already know are so prevalent in our system, where if you're a person, even of median means, who can afford a private attorney, your likelihood of ending up on death row just plummets. And so it really heightens that disparity, and I think makes a mockery of our constitutional rights in many ways.
Right. And actually, one of the most expensive parts of a death penalty defense really isn't even the lawyer. So it's actually the experts that you have to hire, because the process requires a mitigation expert. So this is a person who, this is probably the largest expense. And even if you could afford a lawyer on your own, affording a good mitigation expert is nearly impossible. This is the person that is going to go back in time and investigate the offender's or the defendant's life from birth to now, and find everything from school records to counselor records to high school, college transcripts, employment records, everything through this person's history, because the Constitution requires that if a jury is going to consider a death penalty, then they have to know everything about this individual to see if there are any mitigating factors in person's existence that may mitigate the responsibility for their actions. And so that part is just tremendously expensive. You can imagine. Then you go to a rural state like Wyoming, where our towns are hours and hours apart, and there are hardly any airports in the state of Wyoming. So you're driving hours and hours, miles and miles to investigate a person's life. Those dollars stack up really quickly.
Definitely. I think we could talk about this part of the problem for another hour, but I'm going to switch the subject now because I want to get to a few more things, and I see quite a few questions for us to get to too. So kind of taking the lens out more broad, we have seen a real tidal wave of Republican support for repealing the death penalty in recent years. And I don't think that the average American knows how much has transpired and changed since 2000 on this issue. It used to be a very partisan issue. It used to be very popular as a whole. And it used to be something that we really, we used quite a bit. You know, we were carrying out hundreds of executions and new sentences every year. That has really plummeted in the past couple of decades. New death sentences have decreased about 60% since 2000. So even when given the option, juries are typically going for a lesser sentence like life in prison without parole. Last year was the 5th in a row the country carried out fewer than 30 executions. I think there were 25 last year, and they came from only 7 states. Texas is usually responsible for about 40 to 50% of those executions on its own at this point. We've had 22 states repeal legislatively. We have 3 other states with moratoriums in effect. And, you know, there's a couple states that are chomping at the bits. I think Wyoming could repeal in the next year. I think Ohio could be quickly behind Wyoming. I think we see a lot of interest in Utah and Virginia and North Carolina and Kentucky. And so there's just a lot of momentum that's transpiring. Last year, we had 10 states with Republican-sponsored bills to repeal. About 56 different Republicans across those 10 bills were signed on as sponsors. Many others voted in favor. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about if this continues, what impact the federal executions has on this trend, and if you think that the battle is largely won or if you think it's still uphill.
I think it's still uphill with the federal execution issue. I think that states, like you've clearly pointed out, states are very much warm to this idea of repealing the death penalty. I think that the COVID pandemic creates that extra burden on states where they're looking for different and creative ways to balance their budgets. Repealing the death penalty is certainly one of them. Criminal justice reform as a whole is going to impact budgets. And so I think you're going to see a lot more of that activity at the state level than the federal level. I think the battle is definitely at the federal level, particularly because we currently don't have a president who supports repeal. But I have a lot of hope in President Trump. And the reason why is because if you look at other issues that Donald Trump has taken a stance on that are similar in the libertarian conservative camp, for example, international affairs and isolationism and bringing our troops home. And I don't think that was, that's not traditionally a position that the modern Republican presidency has taken. But Donald Trump has relied heavily on advice from people like Senator Rand Paul to guide him on those issues. And so that gives me great hope that because someone like Senator Rand Paul actually has the ear of Donald Trump on issues, which I wouldn't say that he had the ear of past Republican presidents on issues, that it's possible that influencers like Rand and others, if they are willing to speak on issues like this, I think we can influence the federal level. So when you have momentum at the state level, it builds. But I also just think that the perfect storm exists in current Washington for us to put definitely more pressure on the feds.
And last question before I hand it over, because I want to make sure we touch on this. You mentioned COVID and the current perfect storm. You and I have both been very concerned with issues of racial bias in our system and with many of the issues we've seen elevated this summer through the protest, police brutality, and just having a deep concern about what conservatives need to do on these issues. I see direct tie-ins to the death penalty. I know, Wyoming's demographics are much more white than a lot of states, but we do see even in Wyoming, there's discrepancy, and across the nation certainly continue to see racial bias in our government's policies. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are as a lawmaker and as a conservative, and how conservatives should approach these topics and where their voices should be.
Right. Well, I think that conservatives have always been a strong voice for law and order. But as a voice of law and order, it means supporting a system that has constitutional rights, that protects and really pushes those constitutional rights forward. So I think that conservatives have an opportunity to control the conversation. We should. These are our issues. They've always been our issues. Criminal justice reform, advocating for a just and fair system, for equality before the law. All of those things have always been deeply conservative. And so I think we should harness the opportunity and champion them. And I will say in Wyoming, I've taken my criminal justice reform efforts beyond the death penalty to a lot of the things that you're speaking about. And I would say that right now, I think that people across the country's eyes are more open than they ever were before to the injustices of our justice system, whether we're talking about on the streets with our police, or we're talking about in the courtroom with judges, lawyers, and juries, or all the way to the execution chamber. Our eyes are opening right now. And so there is just a prime opportunity for us to continue pushing forward, shedding more light on all those injustices, and not letting go of it being our issue that we've always championed criminal justice reform, and we shouldn't hand over the mantle to any other ideology.
Yeah, beautifully put. Well, Jared, I just want to say how much I appreciate and respect your leadership. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Q&A?
Yes, I completely agree. I really have to admire the ability of a legislator to go forward with an issue that is controversial. And I think that we see in the repeal in Colorado, the repeal before that in New Hampshire, I mean, those were activities that were really pushed ahead by the legislators. So in that light, there is a question that I have. In the state of California, of course, we can only repeal the death penalty by ballot initiative, which is a completely different thing from, working with your legislators. So what would you say, and a little more background too, in California, there are several counties that are responsible for the vast number of people on death row. And the rest of the counties pay for the costs of the prosecution and defense of a lot of people on death row who are not from their county and who are not even related to their counties. What do you think is the most persuasive argument you can offer to your average citizen to vote to repeal the death penalty?
Sure. So well, it's hard to pick just any issue, but I think that what you're keying into is education, and that education is truly key. Hannah had started off, and she said something to the extent of, the default position that people just believe that penalty detours and that it's the only way that we can have justice. And I think that's true, that it's a default position no matter where you are, frankly, in the world, because if you look at human existence for all of our time on this earth, our governments carrying out the death penalty has actually been the norm. So I think that is a default position deeply inside of a human, but they don't necessarily know why. I think it's just education. I don't know that there's any one particular issue that resonates with someone better than anything else. I think you need to speak to people with what resonates to them. It may be fiscal responsibility. It may be their morals. It may be their religious belief. It may be that they're pro-life. Whatever it is, it may be that they see other injustices in the justice system. Certainly anyone who is a part of the movement right now that protests the police brutality on our streets, this should resonate with them. It's a justice issue. So I think you just have to educate, and you have to find the issue that resonates and speak to them in whatever way that resonates to them, and not start with the assumption that whatever you believe makes the death penalty wrong or immoral or unjust is what other people will believe. Talk to them and figure out what they really, what their values and morals are and their principles. And I bet once you do that, you'll find very quickly that it doesn't square with most people's principles. Nancy, you're muted.
A question that we're getting here is a question about evangelicals as, as a group, as an ideology, they strongly lean conservatively. What do you think is the most effective argument with evangelicals? And do you feel like we are making any headway with that community?
I feel like that's a perfect question for Miss Hannah.
Well, as a pastor's kid, I have a lot of experience in that community. And I think one problem, and Jared touched on this briefly, is trying to force your opinions on the issue on other people. Someone who believes that the death penalty is biblical or that it is theologically correct is probably not going to be swayed by what your opinion is on the death penalty, because they think that that is biblical in the Word of God. And so I think too often people try to come in and change people's morals or change their religious views. I don't try to do that. I think that Christians of good faith can disagree on the theoretical appropriateness of the death penalty. I personally fall on the side that I think that was something that was used quite differently than our system. First and foremost, in the Old Testament, there were many, many differences in how they carried that out and how we have carried it out. I also think there's many things you could point to in the New Testament that would dissuade me from believing it was still biblical, but I don't need somebody to change their religion for them to agree the death penalty needs to be repealed, because how it's operating in practice is so flawed. It's an iceberg of issues, and there's really something in there that will compel every person. So I think when you're dealing with any group of people, but even evangelicals, listening is the first key to success. Find out why it is they support it, what it is that they believe about it, have a conversation around it, and don't attack people or call them hypocrites or, really try to get into an area where you're getting into this morality aspect, because I think that that's somewhat subjective at times if you're getting into people's religions and where they feel like it's appropriate for government to be and what role it should play. But whether or not you think that it's appropriate for government to carry this out, we can say that our government has not been capable of carrying it out in a way that ensures that we don't kill innocent people and that it's not biased and overrun with different arbitrary factors that are really unfair.
There are a lot of conversations about the political use of the death penalty, particularly in the recent executions. The perspective from my world, which is the abolition perspective, is that the federal executions were established purely for political purposes in this time frame, and that the executions were really, possibly done illegally. The question about politics and the death penalty is something that drives a lot of district attorney races. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say it's so true, and it is such an issue because even in Wyoming, as I search for co-sponsors or I search for votes, some of the more difficult votes, as I have conversations with my colleagues, I would say most of them are either ambivalent, or they either support repeal, they're ambivalent, or they find a lot that they resonate with, but they're not wholly there. And the ones that resonate a lot but aren't wholly there, at the end of the day, they usually fall back on some of the other elected officials in their districts, and it is almost always the prosecutor. And they say, "But my prosecutor." Mm-hmm. And so I think it's right. It goes back to, in my opinion, some of the statements we made earlier, that this is the default position that people want law and order and they want justice, and that's what justice is. And changing hearts and changing minds in legislative bodies is one thing. Changing those minds and hearts of prosecutors probably is a big key to abolishment, because those are people that can really speak to justice and really show their constituents that you can have justice without it. But I would say that even without prosecutors on board, the system itself shows that it's broken, because most of our people who sit on death row sit there for decades. And so by the time we roll around, like out of our recent executions, we know, what was it? Our gentleman out of Louisiana, he was from Oklahoma. His name is escaping me right now, but the victim's family came out and advocated very much against his execution recently. And I think that's in large part because as time goes on, as most humans forgive and move forward, and that's so I think it shows that there's a defect in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Hannah?
I was just going to say that it is political, and I don't know that it's always partisan. We see that both Democrat and Republican prosecutors will use that. I think that ultimately the problem with it is it functions like security theater, right? It's something that I think for many people gives the illusion of justice. It seems like a nice way to tie it up and make things better, and it has all these false promises that we often see prosecutors tell the victim's family members. This will bring closure. This is something that you need. This is something that will help you heal and move forward. And so many of them turn against it because they see that the opposite is true, and they really find that they're not getting other better services that they could use to help them more effectively heal and rebuild their lives. And so I do think that there's a bit of a political football that gets thrown around. And I think as people continue to see behind the curtain of the justice system more and more, they're recognizing the theater aspect of this. We're spending a lot of money, we're beating our chest, we're not producing safer communities, we're not producing more whole, healed people. This is not working.
Frequently, when there are, in California, for example, in the two previous abolition initiatives, the major contributors to defeat those initiatives, the contributors that were supporting maintaining the death penalty and speeding up the death penalty, the majority of those contributors were law enforcement organizations, unions, and sheriff's departments and correction officers and so on. And what do you say to them? How do you help them see things in a different way so that we can move those people forward as well?
Well, we've built very large coalitions in other states made up of law enforcement and former prosecutors and attorneys general and judges and members of corrections who can all speak to the fallibility of the system and why it's not actually producing the results that we need. I think that you do commonly find those people are more apt to come forward once they're retired and not beholden to a union or to the group that they are currently serving in. That's a problem with unions. I'm a conservative. I have a huge issue with unions. We could do a whole other panel on that. But especially taxpayer funded lobbying that we see a lot of these unions continue to contribute to. I think that That's a problem in our system that needs to be fixed. But I think that the best way to refute their statements when they are actively working against reform is to produce insiders and people who've sat in those positions who can counter that, and they do it quite well.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that with, I think that's right, because it's more of a default position, I think, for law enforcement, and not necessarily that they have good substance when they want to stand against it. In Wyoming, one of our biggest proponents was actually the director of the Department of Corrections, he just recently retired, and of note, he is the longest serving head of Department of Corrections in the country's history. And he served prior to Wyoming, he served in Texas, and he served as a warden on death row. And so he was a phenomenal voice in Wyoming to come out and say, listen, I have served in corrections my entire life, and here is my opinion of the death penalty, and here is my opinion of the people on death row, and here's my opinion of the system. And so I think Ken is right. You have to find the voices inside of the systems. With law enforcement in general, again, I'll just throw this plug out there again. I think right now is such a big opportunity time for advocates of abolition to partner with law enforcement, because they are under the nation's microscope. And because we are right now more than ever, we see a lot of the bumps and the breaks in our system on the streets in particular. And so law enforcement has an opportune moment in time to instead stand for a system because it's a system that they have and they know, and rather be advocates for reform inside the systems that they operate. And I think they'll find more allies and more good for the entire country if they do that.
Hannah, do you have anything to contribute to that?
I already answered that one.
Oh, right. Let me ask you another thing too. A common debate among the abolition community is the idea of life without parole. Tell me, I mean, from a conservative point of view, is life without parole something that should even be a consideration?
I think that life without the possibility of parole is the alternative to the death penalty. I think that, at the end of the day, I don't believe that people are born good or born bad. I think they make good or bad choices. I think that most people that make bad choices, especially a choice to take another human's life, because we have to remember that there are people inside the system that are murderers. They have taken another human life, and they've made a bad choice. And most likely they've made that bad choice because they don't have the same control of their faculties that you and I do. It means that they either have extreme mental illnesses or an extreme history of abuse or substance abuse or whatever it is that has changed their world so that they can't make the same choices that you and I make that are good. At the end of the day, the reality is that person, some of those people are dangerous to society. I personally don't believe the moral thing to do is to remove that human's existence. But the moral and the right thing and the just thing certainly is if a person is guilty of a murder and they can't control their faculties and there is no reform for them because of that, then we have to remove them from society. I also think it does serve a punishment factor, because that is a part of our justice system. I wholeheartedly believe that the justice system should be about reform. It absolutely should be about changing people's lives and reintroducing them back into society. But for a lot of folks, that isn't necessarily possible based on their choices. And so another aspect beyond reform is that you do still have to have safety and security, but you also have to have justice. And so I think that life without parole is very appropriate.
And we're a single issue organization, so I'm not really at liberty to comment outside of the work that we do. I think probably the life in prison without parole system has every bit as much corruption and innocence issues and problems as the death penalty system does. And I think getting rid of the death penalty would hopefully give better review to those cases and take some of the weight off of the system in that way.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I just wanted to point out we're doing this series of webinars. The webinars are here to address various myths about the death penalty. And this is the first of ours, which is the conservative view. And lots of your focus is on fairness, cost, maybe abuse of power or too great power. The other issues that we're seeing are closure, the issue of closure, the issue that the death penalty isn't a deterrent, that it doesn't make the community safer, the issue of tremendous racial injustice in the application and seeking of the death penalty, innocence, of course, and as you mentioned, and I have to thank you for this, Jared, because it's something that doesn't come up often, is the issue of how unfair these trials can be. The cost of defending someone in a death penalty case to a county, if it's a county that carries that burden of cost, could be tremendous. So for a small county, as you said, Jared, it's the wealthy counties that actually seek the death penalty. And how do those counties justify that to the rest of the citizens in the small counties and to the burden that is to them as far as taxes go?
Yeah, it's a great question. They only justify it because they haven't been called on it yet in the Supreme Court. I think that exact question before the Supreme Court, they would have to find it unconstitutionally unconstitutional as applied, excuse me. And you remember that the original issue with the constitutionality of the death penalty in the United States was based on its application. And so then when it was brought back in the 70s, we changed the way that it's applied, supposedly. Another area that the constitutional question begs itself is on the racial aspect and how it's applied unequally or unjustly as well. In Wyoming, I can't speak greatly to that just because of the reality of the demographics of the state of Wyoming, but I can speak greatly to what you mentioned, which was that socioeconomic divide between counties. The interesting thing in Wyoming is that we have sought diligently to get the data that we need to prove that beyond what data we do have. The unfortunate thing is that the data comes from prosecutors, and even as a legislator requesting the data, prosecutors ignore my request. They don't have an interest in divulging the data on who they prosecute, how often they prosecute, when they prosecute. We have a snapshot of that in the state of Wyoming that we obtained a year ago, and that snapshot reveals what I'm talking about. But I don't think they actually do defend it. I think that they defend it by not showing the numbers. I think that, Hannah mentioned the 2% of all capital cases really exist within, would you say 2% of counties or something of that nature. But I think the reality is that if you take that and you really blow it up on a larger scale, and if the numbers were there and there was a constitutional challenge, I think it would make a very interesting Supreme Court case.
Do you have any other comments? Do you have closing comments you'd like to make?
I would just encourage people to continue to plug in. I know some people can get rather discouraged given the state of some of our justice system stories over the past couple of months. And I know that it has often felt very siloed and lonely to do this kind of work, but I really do see tremendous ground being made and continue to see our ranks growing and growing. And I think that we'll continue to see more and more success. It just takes time. It takes educating people. It's slow work. It's interpersonal work. But I think, the old saying that we say in the movement of the death penalty being a mile wide, or support the death penalty being a mile wide and an inch deep, is true. You've just got to get in front of people with the facts. And I think most people will pretty quickly change their minds on this. So we'd love to help people plug in. We're really active in a number of states. We're looking forward to the future and we're excited. And I told Jared, if I had him in every state, I think we'd be done by now.
Yeah. Thanks, Hannah. I think in closing, I'd say a lot of the same. Education. I really love the idea of continuing the conversation, just having that conversation, because it's not one that I think most families probably have at the dinner table. Hey, should we have a death penalty or not, kids? But I think it is such a pivotal and important issue, and so much of the the reform that is needed in our justice system will come as well, I think, as a product of true abolition and true reform on the death penalty. So I think you keep having that conversation. You know, I ran into, we're in election season, and I'm in the capital city of Wyoming, and there's a gentleman running for mayor of the capital city, and I ran into him last week at a picnic. He came over to me and wanted to talk to me about the death penalty. He said, I spent my whole life, and he's much older than me. I spent my whole life, Jared, being for the death penalty. You know, you're always in the news on it. So it forced me to actually read about it. And once I started to read about why you don't support it, I changed my mind almost immediately. It's just something I didn't think about, is what he said to me. So I think we have to continue to be advocates, continue to just discuss it and educate, and it will come with time. Certainly the days of the death penalty are numbered.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for your great work. I'd like to say next week we are having another webinar. One of the myths of the death penalty is public safety. So to speak to those issues, we have Chesa Bodine from San Francisco, Beth McCann from Denver, both of whom have said that they will not seek the death penalty under any circumstances. So please join us for that. The email will be coming out. Please support Death Penalty Focus, and you can text "end executions" to 56512, which is in the chat box. I thank both of you, and I thank all of you who came to join us for this important meeting. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah,
Thank you.